I love this scripture. It's one that's not usually used in our 3 years of reading through the scriptures, but it's a good one. The idea of what Jesus is doing here, I think, is powerful. There's many ways to tell the story. And this is what I think the conversation between Jesus and God might have been like. Jesus sitting in the boat saying, God, I've done a lot of this work, have done a lot of different things. Finally, I'm getting to relax. Oh, I'm so glad, God, that you were able to make lakes where I could listen to the waters splash and calm my nerves. God, did you realize while I was teaching the 5,000 people about your many wonders, about how amazing you are and what's available for all these people, I was also teaching the disciples at another level. As leaders, they need to know that it just takes a little bit, and you can feed so many people. The lesson plan for the disciples. It was 5,000 people. They were all hungry. I know, God. There's no Papa John's. There's no McDonald's. That'll come later. I know that the disciples saw it. 5,000 people, they were fed with 5 loaves of bread. What an amazing thing. Oh, and then, any good lesson plan means there will be the follow-up lesson to make sure that the disciples really got it. So there was a feeding of the 4,000. 7 loaves. Did they get it? Well, I thought they got it. Oh, but God, sorry, this conversation's going to be interrupted. I need to go. These disciples are just really upset in this boat. Disciples, we have one boat, maybe 12 of you, and 1 loaf of bread, and this is a problem? 1 loaf of bread for 12 people? That's easy. We just did the 5,000, feeding the 5,000 with 5 loaves, feeding 4,000 with 7 loaves. And you're arguing about 12 people and 1 loaf. I do wonder at that moment, was Jesus just frustrated? Was Jesus beside himself saying, I thought the disciples got it. That yeast, that learning that they were doing, I thought it was all going well. Oh, but maybe some of that cynical yeast, that fear from the Pharisees has snuck in, and the disciples are doubtful. So, what do I want you to know? I want you to know that so often, as people of faith, we can't imagine that we, a little tiny speck of yeast, we as a mustard seed, we as tomato seeds, can't possibly make an impact on our world. I can't do that much, can I? Can you do that much? Well, the rest of this message, will be the video message. Because at the Church of the Brethren annual conference this year, there was the video message of the not so big church. And it's directed to each of us. Oh, it's about the faith of the church, but it's also about your faith and how big you think you are and how much you, as a little piece of yeast, can do for this world. Watch and see.
Once upon a time, there was a church. It wasn't a big church. It wasn't even a medium-sized church. Most people called it small. But this church had big ideas. A while ago, the church noticed that disasters were especially hard on children. The not-so-big church had an idea to offer pop-up child care centers right beside the disasters, where parents were dealing with paperwork and putting their lives back together. Specially trained volunteers made a place for children to be children, to play, to feel safe. The church kept this up for years, training people all across the country, even as far away as Hawaii. Then there came a time when there were so many disasters that lots of these volunteers were needed all at once. There were 2 hurricanes, wildfires, floods, a volcano, a train crash, a horrific shooting. In just 1 year, there were 17 disasters that needed childcare volunteers. But the church was ready for such a time as this. Those 2 hurricanes blew through the Caribbean, and Maria hit especially hard on the island of Puerto Rico, one of the 24 districts of this not-so-big church. Some people lost homes. Everyone lost power. The church sent people to help with the recovery and shipped a container load of supplies. It had been 70 years since the first congregation was established there, and relationships have grown over generations. Remember the beginning of the work in South Sudan? The not-so-big church went there long before there was even a country called South Sudan. The ministry builds up the church presence there, responds to human need, and works for peace and reconciliation. It's been some of the hardest work the church has done, but today there's a peace center in Torit. This not-so-big church has a sister church in Nigeria. These brothers and sisters have suffered greatly because of Boko Haram. Many people have died. Some were kidnapped. Buildings were burned. The church in the U.S. sent people and food and money. The church also invited organizations in Washington to meet with leaders from the Nigerian church. By working together, they could make their voice bigger. When these organizations met with politicians, they described their connections with Nigeria. Some said, "We've been working there for 5 years." They went on around the table. And then, the not-so-big church said, "We've been in Nigeria for 95 years. We built the school in Chibok. The church saw that there was devastating violence in the U.S., not just in other countries, and much of it was gun violence. So the church spoke out for peace, and many of its members took to the streets to make a public peace witness. One of the church's big ideas was to hold a conference for older adults. That was 25 years ago, and people over 50 are still heading to Lake Junaluska, North Carolina, for a week of worship and inspiration. It's a lot like National Youth Conference, except no one sits on the floor, and bedtime is a little earlier. You're never too old to grow in faith. There was a small country that the world said was no good. The not-so-big church had a big idea to help this country feed its people. Over the years, a number of church members visited North Korea to work on agriculture projects, something these folks knew well. Eventually, a couple was assigned to teach agriculture to students at a university. After a while, it became too risky for them to stay, but the church had developed a connection that spans the miles. As North Korea takes center stage in the world's attention, this church continues to pray for its people and for the possibility of peace. The not-so-big church felt rather small, but even so, it said yes to a request from the people in the faraway countries of Rwanda, Burundi, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The people in the Great Lakes region of Africa had heard of the church's peace-building work, and that is what they needed. Now, several years later, this mission work includes trauma healing, soybean growing, and church planting. It's what the church calls a holistic gospel. The Great Lakes region is far away, but not too far away for a young adult work camp to go to Burundi. The previous year, young adults went to Nepal. And in a host of work camps all across the U.S., junior and senior high school students serve and grow in faith. One of the church's big ideas was a volunteer program that sent people across the country and around the world to spend a year, sometimes more, sharing God's love in acts of service. Brethren Volunteer Service just turned 70 years old, and now some 7,000 people have passed through its doors, giving, but also receiving. Sure, they are helping others, but the volunteers are changed too. Sometimes ideas start small and then get big. The not-so-big church planted congregations in the Dominican Republic. Then people from that church moved to Spain and started a fellowship there. And then people from that church in Spain started another one in London. More than 300 years after the Brethren movement began in Germany, new seeds are being planted again in Europe. Dominicans also took the church to Venezuela. How will that grow? Right now, the mission work involves worship and education. There's been a feet washing service and baptisms. The political situation in Venezuela is tense, and there are plenty of opportunities for a peace church to make a witness. The not-so-big church was growing in some parts of the world, but it felt fragile in the United States. Members worried about their disagreements and wondered what their future was. So the General Secretary visited every district to listen to people. The church decided to work together on a vision that would unite them. The church magazine doubled the number of different writers contributing to its pages. The church got together at its annual meeting because talking and worshiping together seemed like a good idea. The church worked at listening to people of color in their midst, recognizing that it can be difficult for them to feel comfortable in a church that's predominantly white. The church recognized that some of the big ideas written in church papers hadn't gotten very far, but determined to keep trying. But the growing edges of this not-so-big church are interracial, and that was celebrated at New and Renew, a conference on church revitalization and church planting. The conference was planned and led by a volunteer committee that represented these areas of growth. In a not-so-big church, publishing Sunday school materials is definitely a big idea. Many larger churches have decided they can't afford it anymore. But this church's children's curriculum, called Shine, Living in God's Light, is holding its own and even growing into other denominations. One customer called to say that Shine had gotten a shout-out in a Presbyterian webinar. "Shine is the best," she said. Sharing food is one of the ways this not-so-big church shows God's love. This church helps develop community gardens and congregations across the country and in many places around the world. It's continuing the work of Jesus, who had compassion for the hungry and fed the multitudes. Who is this small church with big ideas?
That church is us. Those individual pieces of yeast are you and me and the people sitting next to you. God cares about each of us, and what a potential there is for us and this world. Go and live in that hope. Amen.